Welcome back to 5 Good Questions. I'm your host, Jake Taylor. Our guest today is Michael Yogg. Michael is trained as both a historian and an investor. He holds 3 degrees in history from Yale and Harvard and worked in the investment business in Boston from 1978 until 2012. He worked his way up from analyst to portfolio manager, all the way up to chief investment officer. And before that, he taught history at Harvard and served as an officer in the U.S. Navy. Michael knew the subject of his book, Paul Cabot, from 1978 to 1994. Let's ask him 5 good questions. Welcome back to the show, everyone. My guest today is Michael Yogg, author of Passion for Reality. Hey, Michael, where are we chatting with you today?
I'm at home in my office in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
How's the weather today there?
Well, it's pretty nice today. If you're a New Englander anyway, it's sunny and it's probably seems like high 40s.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
I had the top down on my convertible for the first time since November, so that was good news.
That's good. Yeah, I'm coming out to the East Coast in a couple days. I was hoping you were going to say it was 70 like it is here in California.
Well, that's funny because I'm going to California.
Well, I'll see you in Denver on the way home. All right, are you ready for 5 good questions, Michael?
I certainly am.
Great. So question number 1, your book is really centered around this interesting character, Paul Cabot. What was his and his team's approach to investing, and why were they so successful?
Well, I think the first thing you have to remember is he started out in 1924, and the stock market was sort of just coming into favor, and a lot of things being done were being done for the first time. So his approach was not that unusual for today. I mean, he focused on fundamentals of companies, which included, their operations and their outlook, and the character and ability and personality of management, and just really learning about the fundamental business. So that was number 1, fundamentals. Number 2, I think compared to others, he paid a lot of attention to valuation and not just looking at dividend yield, which was common in that day, but actually he was among the first, possibly the first, but certainly among the first to look at the PE ratio, the price earnings ratio, and not just the yield. And of course, this is when dividend payouts started to go down. Companies were not paying out all their earnings in the dividend. But I think the most important thing about his approach is not only was it fundamental research, but it was face-to-face, sort of in-your-face type of research, where if he was investing in a company, he'd get on the train, he'd go to New York, he'd go to Cleveland, he'd go to Chicago, he would sit in the CEO's office, sort of eyeball to eyeball, and ask him exactly what he wanted to know. And because in the 20s and 30s and even in the 40s and 50s, inside information rules and regulations and court decisions weren't as clear as they are today and actually were more lenient, He got great information, and he was really certainly among the first and probably the first to go out and visit managements in their offices, in their factories. Yeah. So I'd say fundamentals, valuation, and face-to-face interviews is the most important thing.
And that's a pretty profound insight to look at retained earnings and not just dividend yield if you're compounding those retained earnings inside the business.
Yes. And again, I'm not saying he was the first, but it really became fairly common in the 20s. And he started it right when he started his business in 1924.
Great. So question number 2. The book provided a lot of nuances about open-ended versus closed-end funds, which were kind of more of a contest between those two back then. Could you explain briefly the difference between those two and how that impacted Cabot's enterprises?
Yes. Today, most mutual funds are open-end. Mm-hmm. If you want to buy a share or 1,000 shares, Putnam or Fidelity or Vanguard, Wellington, they'll issue shares for you, and they'll take the money in and they'll invest it. So that's open-end. And if you want to redeem, they'll give you your money at net asset value. So the number of shares in an open-end fund, because it's open, the number of shares can go up and down, and they're always willing to sell new ones and always willing to redeem old ones. In the 20s, there might be a 72-hour waiting period, but you could get your money back pretty darn soon. A closed-end fund has a fixed number of shares, unless there's a new offering. Uh, and if you wanted to sell, you might have to sell at a discount. You have to sell your shares. You can't sell them back to the management company. You have to find a buyer. So if you want to sell, you might have to sell at a discount. You might not. If you want to buy, you might have to pay a premium. And of course, there are these market makers, the Goldman Sachs and Kidder Peabody's in those days would try to make a spread. So that could be a little more expensive. But that's the fundamental difference. And today, obviously, the open-end fund was the more successful model because that accounts for 98, 99% of money under management today.
Great.
The other thing about open-end funds, the point that Paul Cabot made is that it improves management, in his opinion, because people voted with their feet. If management, he said, if expenses are too high, they can get their money back. If he said, if they just don't like the color of my eyes, they can redeem their shares. Whereas you could sell closed-end shares, but you had to find a buyer. So he felt that there was more pressure on him, and for that reason.
That makes sense. So question number 3. Cabot ended up being a very vocal leader when a lot of pretty monumental financial legislation was being created. He gave his input a lot, and a lot of that stuff still echoes into today. How did he influence government leaders like that and the legislation that sort of shaped the future of the finance industry?
Well, let me say, he was very prominent in the 30s in Washington, spent a lot of time in Washington lobbying, and also 1940. So the two most significant pieces of legislation that he was involved in are, number one, the Revenue Act of 1936. And this was important because it meant that the mutual fund itself didn't pay taxes on dividends as long as the dividends were passed on to shareholders, and the shareholders paid taxes. Because if there was double taxation at the mutual fund level and the shareholder level, that would have put them out of business.
Yeah, that'd be triple with at the business level too.
Exactly, it would be triple taxation, and they would not be able to compete. And this actually, there was triple taxation for 1 year between the passage of the 35 Revenue Act and the passage of the 36 Revenue Act. So it was only 1.5%. It was 90% discounted and then 15% on the 10%. So it was only 1.5%, but it was a precedent, and they were very worried about it.
Sure.
So that was very important for the survival of the industry. And incidentally, that was for the open-end funds only. The closed-end fund did have to pay that tax for another 6 years. So that gave them a competitive advantage over the closed-end funds in 6 years, but 6 very important years. And then the other piece of legislation was the Revenue Act in 1940, which really set the standards, the ethical standards of the business and the way it operated. And it really was done pretty much on the Boston model. It wasn't just Paul Cabot's company, but there were 3 or 4 or 5 companies in Boston who did business in a certain way. And I would say the Investment Company Act and the Investment Advisors Acts of 1940 sort of took the Boston model. But your question is, I think, why was he so effective? That's what you asked, right?
Right.
And I would say a lot of reasons. Number one, he had contacts. He came from a prominent family. He went to Harvard. He belonged to this club, the Porcellian, that had a lot of influential members. So he had the contacts. He had a reputation for honesty. He had written an article in the 1920s, which he got published because his uncle was the editor of Atlantic Monthly. And he was known as an honest guy with a good investment record and someone who understood the abuses of mutual funds because he had studied the London funds in the 19th century, saw the abuses, and this gave him an edge when these things happened in the 1920s on Wall Street. So he had a reputation for honesty. He was an effective speaker. He was a plain talker, no baloney, got right to the point, very forceful, very passionate about what he believed. And at the same time, he really cared about the shareholders. And I think that came through at a time in the 1930s when there was a lot of scandals, especially from the 1920s, came to light in the 1930s. So Wall Street and investing had a bad reputation. He had a good reputation, so people listened to him.
Yeah. The tide went out, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Warren Buffett said, when the tide comes out, you can tell who's
Swimming naked.
swimming
Yeah.
naked.
So, question number 4. You had this really interesting observation in the book about Warren Buffett's faith in management, specifically his quote about, when a reputation of a good management comes into contact with the reputation of a tough business, it's usually the business who ends up with their reputation after that, versus Paul's contrasting faith in that, which was kind of the opposite. And you had the observation that was sort of the product of both of their time periods in which they've operated. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes. I think Buffett is right. And obviously, he's done very well. Business fundamentals and the situation is very important today because there's so much change going on. We've got, trade and technology, globalization and technology are such big forces. And it really goes back to the 70s because you had great steel companies in the 70s or great auto companies. And but they weren't really as great as the Japanese, for a while anyway. They were not as great as the Japanese and later Korean companies in steel and in autos, especially after the Arab oil embargo and the rise in gasoline prices. So they had managements, I won't say they were fantastic, but they were really blindsided by world events in the 70s. And that's really been continuing. So I think that, Buffett says, you can have a great manager, but what is he going to do when the Korean autos or the Japanese steel comes in the 70s? Paul Cabot, on the other hand, so Warren Buffett, if you call his career from 1965 or 1970 till today, and hopefully into the future, he saw a lot of structural change in these industries because of globalization and technology. Paul Cabot's career, the heart of it was maybe, call it 1925 to 1970. These were very eventful times. You had World War II, you had the Great Depression. I'm not saying nothing happened. But in terms of the structure of industries, you had new industries arising, particularly in the 20s and the 50s. In the 20s, you had radio or insurance really became more, automobiles. And in the 70s, you had, in the 50s, you had, Boeing and IBM and Merck and, SmithKline and companies like that. So you had change, but you didn't have the extreme structural change, say in the steel industry, in the auto industry, that you had after imports came in. After World War II, most of the world was flat on its back and American industry didn't have the competition. Then all of a sudden they're in a global industry, there are more variables. So management has more challenges. In Paul's era, from 25 to 70, you really could study the steel industry, study the managements, assess their abilities, understand their strategies, anticipate what was going to happen. And managements really did control their own destiny to a certain extent. So Paul Cabot was really right until about 1970. But I say in the book, if Paul Cabot hadn't retired, he'd either have to change his thinking or we wouldn't be writing books about him. Yeah. I didn't say that, but he wouldn't have the reputation he had and has if he had kept that mindset into the 70s. And even in the 50s, his company, State Street Research and Management, had kind of a tough time because they're really good at finding the best utility and the best oil company and the best auto company. But they really didn't fully participate. They made money in AT&T. They did really well with electric utilities. And Paul Cabot and some of his partners had great, intense focus and vision. But I fault them a little bit on their peripheral vision. They couldn't see Boeing and Merck on the horizon, and I won't say they didn't own them. They owned them and they made money. But the really great performers in the 50s, the mutual funds who led the pack in the 50s, everyone did well in the 50s. And there was more emphasis on absolute than relative performance. But the best funds in the 50s had to have Merck, had to have Boeing, had to have IBM, et cetera.
Right.
So Buffett is great, and he's right for his era, and Cabot was great for his era. But maybe he retired just in time, or maybe he would have adjusted. I don't know.
That's an interesting thought experiment. So, question number 5. Mr. Cabot seemed to take his fiduciary duty extremely seriously. And where do you think that came from him as far as his personal background? And why isn't that more the norm today, it seems like?
Well, to some extent, money management really began in Boston. You had court decisions that made it easier for trustees, fiduciaries to buy stocks. You know, people, if you took over a minor's or a widow's trust fund in some states, like important states like New York and Pennsylvania, for a while you had to buy bonds. In Massachusetts, because of what's called the prudent man rule, which I think is some Agassi versus Harvard, someone versus Harvard College, was Justice Samuel Putnam ruled in a famous Massachusetts Supreme Court case that that fiduciaries have to show care. As long as they show reasonable care, they can buy stocks. So Boston was a money center for stock buying, and there was a lot of money in Boston, quite frankly, because of the China trade, because of textiles, because of shoes, because in Boston, unlike other cities, whenever an industry is on the skids, some other industry comes to replace the troubled industry. So, now we have, mini computers went away in the 70s, but we have biotech and money management and what have you. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of money in Boston. And there was just this tradition among Boston, and the trustees were important. They had more latitude. And there was tradition in Boston that the Boston trustee had very high ethical standards and fiduciary standards. And it really started, these people that put out their shingle started their business, and their customers were initially their family and their friends. And they're people that they went to dinner parties with or went to church with. And it was very personal. And maybe because of the Puritan background or the Yankee background, they just, they had very high ethical standards. And today, the environment is different. Number one, it's moved away from Boston. Not that Boston is not still growing, but as a percentage of the money management business, Boston is less. It's more impersonal.
Right.
And there's more trading, and there's just more people who want to get rich in a hurry. Whereas a lot of the Boston trustees, the reason they got into money management is because they had money themselves. And by today's standards, they maybe weren't greedy. I mean, Paul was very ambitious. He wanted to do a good job. He certainly wanted to make a good living. But he wasn't, he was also extremely frugal in his personal life. And I think we've gotten away from that fiduciary trustee tradition that was more prominent when Boston was more the center of money management. And by the way, let me say that my grandparents were immigrants. I have no connection with the Boston Brahmins, but that's the way I see it.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Bonus question number 6 is always asking for a book recommendation.
All right.
What do you have for us today?
That's the one question I'm glad you gave me advance notice on. I chose. I've read a lot of good books, but since I wrote a financial book, and I thought maybe the people watching this interview would be more financially oriented. I thought
generally, yeah,
a book on finance and economics would be appropriate. And I think that When the Music Stopped, which is by what's his name?
Alan Blinder.
Alan Blinder, who's an economist.
Mm-hmm.
I think a financial economist. I believe he used to be at Data Resources. He just really gives a clear and convincing, and in my opinion, relatively non-ideological interpretation of the financial crisis of 2007 and 2009. And I think he explains things pretty well. I did find myself agreeing with him maybe 90% of the time. So maybe my biases are his biases. So I like the book.
Yeah.
But people who I respect and who I know don't think the way I do also like the book. So that's something that is both, it's a good read, and I also think it's a good education. and well worth the time, and certainly well worth the money.
Well, it's unlikely that that was our last, depression or recession that we're ever going to have. So anything you can do to learn about history is always going to be useful.
I think so. And you got to go back further than 2007 too. I mean,
Sure.
you've go back to the tulip bulb craze, and you get some insights into investor psychology, I think.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, I really enjoy it.
Thank you, sir.